first of all, if you could just start by talking about, when we have a weekend like this, a lot of people jump to another year full of crime, but really how are we doing this year from your all's perspective when it comes to violent crime?
Well, we had a pretty busy January and a pretty quiet February up until this point, until this past Saturday. And that's typically how it goes. We have, it kind of goes in peaks and valleys, I would say, especially when it comes to homicide. So we'll be really busy and then have some months where it's a little more quiet for a variety of reasons. But, what that does, when it is a little quieter for the homicide department, it allows them time to work on cases and really pay more closely attention to it. We currently have 11 homicide detectives, and they have their hands full. But when we do have a weekend like this, it is taxing, and they do have to spend a lot of time, at the various scenes.
When we are coming off, 2019 was a record-breaking year for violence. This time, compared to this time last year, kind of where are we sitting?
For homicides, it's pretty similar. I think we are down a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 homicides. But I want to clarify that last year was a record-breaking for homicides. It wasn't for violent crime. We actually had made improvements over the last 2 years when it comes to overall violent crime, but not for homicides, obviously. And even with the improvements in violent crime, it still is, too high and a problem for the entire city and for the police department. So that's what we're looking at. We've made priority, gun violence in particular, a major priority for the department. In January, 9 of the 10 homicides involved firearms. The 3 this weekend involved firearms. So it fits perfectly with what we're seeing and what we're predicting and what we're tackling from the department.
Why do you think it is that gun violence is such a problem here?
It is, I think it's a problem nationwide in a lot of cities and urban cities in particular, but the availability of guns is, continues to increase. There was a story the other day that about 20,000 guns were sold each year in Albuquerque. We see about 1,500 guns stolen each year. So, not only are people getting guns maybe for their own safety or for whatever reason, a lot of those guns are ending up in the wrong hands. They're either being stolen or people aren't being responsible with them. And what we're focusing on is those people who shouldn't have guns, who have felonies, who are using them for violent crime. One of the things we're focusing on, we created a whole violence intervention program. And it's basically 2 parts. The longer term is a focus on especially youth and kind of young men, especially like 18 to 24, and trying to prevent them from even getting into the violence cycle. That's a longer term project. We're working on that with a variety of resources. On the law enforcement side, we've actually kicked up into high gear recently, focusing on those who are actually committing crimes. We have a new program where we're meeting every other week at the chief and commander level. So for instance, last week we met and we're going through every single shooting with injury that happened in the previous 2 weeks. And last week we identified a number of individuals who were suspects, and I can send you their names, but there was one individual who had been tied to 4 different shootings in the past 4 weeks. So we identified him as someone who, if we didn't get him off the streets, he probably would be committing a homicide. So next day he was arrested and put behind bars. There was another individual we identified last week. So that's kind of internal. These are guys who are dangerous, and we need to, they're involved in a lot of shootings, and we want to get them off the streets. So that's one of the programs. The other one is the Metro 15, which has been more publicly facing. And that's been one of our most successful programs. It's, we want the public's involvement in that. And what we're focusing there is violent offenders, but also drivers of violent crimes. So some people, they may not have been involved in violent crime, but they may be involved in auto theft or stealing guns, which get on the streets and are involved in violent crimes. We saw an incident at the Effingbar this past Friday where it allegedly started with an auto burglary or auto theft and resulted in a homicide. So we're focusing on those people, and we need the public's help to help get these guys off the street.
So it sounds like you all are doing a lot of kind of identifying who those offenders are going to be. How does that help you all kind of implement some programs down the road when you identify who does need to be off the street?
Well, the Metro 15 is our really unique program in that we have prosecutors identifying these offenders. So we know who they are. We've arrested a lot of these guys over and over again. And we want prosecutors to help identify people who have warrants outstanding. We know they're drivers of crime. And someone we could work with the prosecutors to get them under pretrial detention and keep them in jail pending trial. So we want them off the streets, and we want a good solid case. So that's worked out. Out of the 27 arrests we've made, I think 25 so far have gotten pretrial detention or are still behind bars. So that's the goal of the program. We hope to continue that. The other part of that is we can't control what the courts do once they get in the system. But one of our deputy chiefs just met this week with a lot of the judges, and I think one of the courts, Metro or District Court, and explained these programs to them so that they would understand that these are priorities, and these offenders that we're identifying are major problems in the community, and that we're fighting to keep them, behind bars pending trial. So I think the judges were receptive, but they were thankful that we explained the program and they know what our priorities are.
I think that's something people talk about a lot is, people get arrested and then they're right back out on the street. Is that something that you all are struggling with at APD as well?
We do. We arrest, our officers arrest people over and over again, and, it's not really anything we can control, but if we identify, the ones who really are a problem for violent crime in the city, we're going to arrest everyone who has a warrant, or who, even if it's a misdemeanor warrant. And we've really stepped up traffic stops, for instance, and we're focusing them in areas of town where hopefully during that traffic stop, if there is a violent offender there, or it's a felon in possession of a gun, and we're seeing a lot of that, or they have narcotics on them. So just by doing traffic stops and being more aggressive, we're going to find that. But we're finding that focusing on those particular individuals and groups and gangs too that are driving a lot of violence, we can tackle it that way as well.
How long do those programs, that violence intervention program, the Metro 15 list, how long does it take, for regular people like me to see the impact of something like that?
Well, I think the Metro 15, another great thing of that is we're seeing immediate effects, because we've seen so many of these offenders stay behind bars. So that's the goal of it. And we want solid prosecution, so they will be, if they're guilty, we want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The other ones are a lot longer term, and you may not feel the impact right away. And what I would say too is it really involves we need the entire community to tackle the problem of violent crime and crime in general in the city. So with the Metro 15, it's not just APD arresting these guys. We make the list. These are metro area offenders, but we have, yesterday, I think Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department made an arrest, Valencia County, Sandoval County, state police make some of these arrests. Whether they know it or not, they're making arrests of the people that we want off the streets. But what happens is we're all ready to prosecute them. So we have files on them, we get them to the prosecutors, and we get going on it. But we need, for the intervention part, to keep these guys and these, it's young men and women, frankly, but mostly young men in the violent crime area, who we think we can step in and cut them off and give them other alternatives to committing crime. That's the longer term, and that's where we need a lot more help from the community.
What kind of help, how does that work? How can people like me help?
Well, I think from the average person, it's just looking out for people. It's just everything, identifying crime, reporting crime. With the intervention part of it, it's more, we have nonprofits and kind of community groups and resources available, volunteers that will work with these young men and women. I think the average person, where they can get involved, is reporting crime in general. And even if it doesn't seem like it's going to make a difference, our focus on gun crimes, even shots fired, there was an incident, I think last night, where there were some shots fired. Nobody was injured. They don't know exactly where the shots came from. But if officers could go and find the gun casings, we have a really aggressive program to identify those casings, identify what gun they came from, potentially, if it's in our database, and maybe solve other crimes. So if you see something, say something.
Are there any parts of town that you all are focused on in particular?
Unfortunately, crime in general is all across the city. When it comes to gun crimes, southeast and southwest are where we're seeing the most recent violence. We saw that, I think, Friday night in the southwest and in the southeast. And then, we don't see as much downtown, but there was the homeless, we had a homeless victim downtown. So that's the other part of this. So we can focus and try to predict where we can catch some of these people before they commit crimes. There's also a random aspect to it. So, when we see the homeless population, they tend to be victims more often than perpetrators. So, we're concerned about homeless individuals that are sleeping, on the streets. We don't know the circumstances behind this shooting yesterday, but, it is disturbing that, this woman was in a tent and apparently shot and murdered. So, you know, our detectives take that very personally, just as much as any high-profile crime that the media focuses on. We want to solve these crimes.
You talked a little bit about at the beginning about detectives and their caseload. Talk a little bit about kind of what their caseload looks like and what needs to be done about that.
Well, with homicide detectives, yeah, they have a huge caseload since we have so many homicides, and in particular the last 3 years. So what happens is, when we came into the office, the Keller administration and Chief Geyer, the previous year homicides spiked to a pretty unacceptable level, and there were only 5 homicide detectives at the time and a sergeant. We doubled the number, and now we expanded it, so we have 11 detectives and a sergeant. But they still inherited all those unsolved homicides, so they're still going after those old cases, looking for new leads, but just picking up new homicides as they come along. So it is taxing. Ideally, we could add more homicide detectives to help solve the crimes. But what we're doing on the other side of things is, in trying to prevent them, is we do have a whole detective bureau and investigation bureau. So we have impact detectives, and then we created a new unit of gun violence reduction detectives. So every gun crime where someone is injured, that GVRU unit is going out, collecting casings, and that's where that information is coming up to the deputy chief and chief level, and we're analyzing it and going after it. So, you know, it's not just the 10 homicide detectives. We have about 120 detectives throughout the department, and, you know, looking at child abuse, sex crimes. But yeah, homicide seems to get the most attention.
Well, I guess, are there any other trends or anything that you would like to share or add?
No, I mean, just narcotics is probably the other thing. You know, we see typically guns is the most prevalent issue involved in a lot of these crimes, and narcotics and gang connections or groups. We're not even seeing a lot of organized crimes, but young people involved in groups, but selling narcotics that might turn into a gun crime. And domestic violence is always an issue. So those are kind of the main motivators, or kind of the nexus of a lot of these crimes that we focus on.
Do you know off the top of your head number of homicide investigations you all have this year so far?
We have, I want to say 10, 13 maybe. I think. I'll double check when I get home, but I think 13.
That to me.
Yeah, and then some of those will drop off. I know there's some that may be reclassified as a self-defense or justifiable homicide or an accidental, and I think there's a couple that are kind of in that gray area, but detectives typically will wait for an autopsy to see exactly what happens and see where their investigation leads them.